It's Aether season time. So Wizards of the Coast have been revealing new cards for the upcoming Aetherdrift set. We've got about a dozen or so, and I wanted to go over some of the more interesting ones and talk about how I think they'll fit into the standard format, and if they're actually going to be playable in other formats like Commander. There's a lot to go through, so I'm just going to dive straight into it, but we're going to start with a really interesting one. We have the Aether Spark. This is the first ever artifact Planeswalker. Up until now, Planeswalkers have just been an object that kind of sits on the side. This is one that you can actually attach to a creature, which is one of the key ways it generates loyalty. It's a pretty difficult card to evaluate, but I'm pretty confident in Standard this card won't see much play. The reason being is Standard is such a fast format right now. You can't really be paying 4 mana to sort of sit around and effectively do nothing if you don't have a creature on the board. Spot removal is also really common, which Aether Spark really struggles into. I think the best thing about this card is probably not the ultimate, which you can realistically look to complete the turn after you play the Aether Spark. I think it's the draw 2 cards piece. I think in some games, particularly longer ones, where you're looking to outvalue your opponent, you can probably expect draw 2 cards to be pretty useful. Outside of that, though, I think those games are going to be far between. You're never going to really want to run this against aggro, which is why I don't really rate it too highly for Standard. I think in Commander, though, this could be a pretty interesting card. I definitely see it fitting into some Voltron strategies. I also think this card really shines if you can equip it without using its loyalty ability. So if you can find a way, such as with the Captain America Commander deck that I know is going around, to effectively equip the Aether Spark for free, I think then you can look to really get some value out of it. I think it's a really ambitious card. I don't really think it's going to be good enough to see play. I'm ready to be wrong though. Up next, we have Basri, Tomorrow's Champion, a D-Sparked Planeswalker. This is a really cool card. In Standard, it's definitely tailored towards cats. Cats are kind of like a mono-white thing that doesn't really see too much play at the moment. I think this is a really important card in that deck, but I don't think it's probably going to be enough to push cats forward. Having said that though, if you enjoy playing cats, I suspect you'll be putting this in the deck. It having a cycling ability is pretty interesting considering it's a legendary creature. One of the problems legendary cards face in formats where you can play multiple copies of them is you can only have one on the battlefield, right? And I think the cycling ability gives Basri a little bit more utility. In Commander, this will definitely have a role to play in cat decks. Ren and Seri comes to mind, but given the abundance of legendary cats we now have in white, I could definitely see Basri playing a role in more than just that deck. Really, if you're playing cats, you're probably going to be playing Basri. Our next card is Bulwark Ox. This 2/2 for 2 mana can be saddled, so that we're bringing back the mechanic from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And it also has the utility to be able to sacrifice it to protect some things. I think it reads better than it looks, personally. One of the challenges I see this card having is you need to have other creatures out on the battlefield, which in Standard, unless you're running pretty insignificant tokens, is quite difficult to do. Saddle 1 makes it really token friendly, but the annoying thing is to get the counters, it needs to attack itself, so it actually needs to survive a turn. More often than not, I think this card's value will be when it's used to protect another creature, which might have some potential. I'm a bit skeptical. And in Commander, I can't really see this card impacting too much. There's so much protection already in Commander. I don't think people really are looking for another option. For that reason, I wouldn't really rate this card too highly. Next up, we have a pretty bombastic mythic vehicle. This is Valor's Flagship. It is keyword soup. It has flying, first strike, lifelink. Its crew cost is a little bit steeper for what it does. It doesn't really do anything aside from, benefit from its keywords when it attacks. Usually when you're paying 7 mana for a card like this, you're usually wanting to cheat it out, so that could be resurrecting it. The fact it's a vehicle makes it a little bit different and a little bit awkward. It also competes directly in Standard with Atraxa, which is pretty much the premier card to be bringing back from the grave, maybe next to Valgavoth as well. I like the cycle ability on this. Personally, though, I think the cost on that is probably just a bit too high to realistically get a lot of value out of it in Standard. In Commander, I could definitely see this having a role as a vehicle-related strategy. Personally, though, I don't think it's going to be making too many waves in the standard format. Next one is one I just wanted to shout out, Hulldrifter. This is probably nothing remotely as good as its cousin Mulldrifter, which is a Pauper staple. Hulldrifter is just here as a little nod to what Magic's past. Definitely not going to be as playable. Repurposing Bay is a really interesting new card that reminds me a lot of Genesis Pod. A pretty notorious green combo deck that was basically used to promote a chain into bigger and bigger creatures. Cards like this are really difficult to evaluate because you need to know in a vacuum kind of... You build a specific deck around a card like Repurposing Bay. In non-constructed formats, Repurposing Bay will probably simply just be a role player. I think it could be really good in a vehicle deck. It's definitely not, I mean, not even a vehicle deck actually. This would probably see play in any artifact deck, and artifacts are quite common in Commander. For this reason, I do think it'll be pretty popular in Commander. I'm a bit skeptical in Standard to see what this card will do. I think it will take someone much smarter than me to figure out how to put the deck together. It's certainly possible. So look, I would say it has decent potential, but it's certainly not I look at it and know immediately what it's going to go with. And the next card, I'm not even going to try and pronounce. This is a new homunculus. It took me about 2 years to learn Fibblefifth's name. So I'm not even going to try and pronounce this one. This card introduces a new mechanic to the set called Start Your Engines, which I'll talk about real quick. I think this mechanic is probably going to be better in Commander than it will be in Standard. Standard, as I said earlier, is a very fast format. I think if you're playing a deck that relies on Start Your Engines, you're going to be super reliant on a certain set of lands that I'll show off in a bit. Having said that, the benefit, if you manage to get all the way to 4, is going to be very huge. Though actually, in hindsight, in this particular card, I don't think it's even that good. Because you do need to play something else to draw a card, or survive to get this creature to survive to the next turn to even get the benefit. So I think among all the Start Your Engines cards I'm going to be covering, this one's probably one of the weakest ones. But I do think there may be a world for Start Your Engines in Commander. I think this is really easy to break in Commander. Much more potential there than it doesn't have in Standard. Next card is a reprint, and this is one I'm quite personally excited about. This is Bloodghast. Very iconic card, known for being a pretty important piece in Sacrifice deck strategies. Sacrifice is kind of a fringe deck in Standard at the moment. We've got Braids, Arisen Nightmare, that's really good with that strategy, and I think Bloodghast will go right into there. It's also got me thinking about other cards like, I know Rottenmouth Viper is a mythic from Bloomburrow that hasn't really seen too much play. I think cards like Bloodghast that can feed cards like the Viper, I think that might be something. Time will tell. I do expect we'll see Bloodghast in Standard in one form or another. I think a card like this is great in an aggro deck, but also great in, as I was saying, the Sacrifice deck. Vampires, if that ever becomes a thing, can also run this, as it is also a vampire. And in Commander, this card is amazing. Very, very strong card in Commander. Used to be much more expensive, but recent reprints have really knocked down the price, which is always great to see. Next, we got Crypt Caller Chariot. At first, I thought this card was really cool. It might have been the art that pulled me in. The more I read this card, though, the more I think there's probably a bit too much setup to get this card going. The payoff of discarding cards to get 2/2 black zombies is great until you read the word tapped. I think we've had this effect for cheaper recently in Standard as well. I think the card is called Dying to Serve that I'm thinking off the top of my head. There's also a hidden value that you lose when you do discard one of your cards, even if, you know, it's not a card you may have seen yourself playing, which I think can't be understated, and I don't think getting a 2/2 tap black zombie really justifies it. And in Commander, I think 1, black isn't really known for having too many vehicles, and 2, I think the payoff for zombie decks isn't really there. I think zombies in Commander have plenty of other cards they can be running, and I just don't think this one does it. Next card is The Last Ride. This is Death's Shadow on a vehicle. Death's Shadow is a very well-known card that basically gains power the lower life you have. was quite a powerful card for some time. I don't think the Last Ride is going to really fill those shoes. I think the most powerful thing about the Last Ride is actually probably its ability to draw a card. Having said that, though, I won't give that too much credit. I think there are better ways to be paying life and draw a card in Standard. I think Lunar Convocation is an Orzhov 2-mana enchantment that is 2 mana to draw a card for paying life. I don't think Last Ride really fills a role, which is a bit of a shame for such a cool looking card. I think losing life to get the benefit of a big creature isn't really going to do it when red will probably kill you. Yeah, I don't think there's really much more to say. The other thing is probably that this is a legendary artifact, which makes it really difficult to probably run more than 2 copies of a card like this in your deck, which also goes against the fact that, you know, the dream of getting a massive creature on turn 2 or 3 gets even harder. So I think there's a lot going against the Last Ride, unfortunately, as cool a card as it is. Oh, and it goes without saying, in Commander, this card is not really going to see any play. Going down to 13 life in Commander is way harder than when you're at 20 life in Standard. Yeah, enough said. Next we got the Quag Feast, perhaps. This is a sorcery speed removal, which is already a bit of a problem for Black. Black has a lot of really efficient 2-mana spot removal. Probably the most interesting thing about this card is that it targets planeswalkers and vehicles. Black's never really been able to remove artifacts. Obviously, vehicles are a subset of artifact, which still keeps it pretty narrow. However, I think the fact that 1, this is a sorcery, as I said earlier, and 2, it can't destroy everything without proper setup, if that makes sense. So if I played, I think the most common example I'm thinking of is, let's say I played a 6-mana creature that was discounted, like Tolarian Terror, but I didn't have any cards in my graveyard, I wouldn't be able to remove this, right? Board cost aside. Which I think goes against this card quite a lot. I think the mill component of it is interesting, but I don't think it's strong enough. I think in Commander, it's a similar story. Spot removal, I would say, is a little bit weaker, particularly sorcery speed spot removal. I don't see it working. Next up, we have the Boommobile, a 4-mana vehicle that pays for itself when you enter the battlefield, which I do think is noteworthy. I think historically, it's really easy to dismiss a card like this as being, you know, just kind of just another artifact, that vehicle that you can crew. I mean, 4 mana for a 5/5 vehicle is pretty inefficient. I think historically, though, cards with ways to abuse mana have historically been ones that are more breakable. And I think Boommobile has potential. Its exhaustibility intrigues me. I think the main thing about this ability, for the record, exhausts single activation abilities. And this one is basically deal X damage to a target. The other text is a lot less relevant because I think there may be a world where Boommobile can be a win con if you manage to generate enough mana. I think someone may find a way to break the add 4 mana of any one color, spend it only to activate abilities component. That text is pretty good into talents. There's probably a few other things, but talents which have really risen in popularity the past few months, I think those are the things to watch out for with a card like this. It lets you develop a future threat while also leveling up a talent, which I don't think can be understated. In Commander, I think a card like this is pretty hit or miss. I mean, if you can generate infinite mana, you can remove 1 target, which obviously is substantially weaker than outright winning the game. I don't see the Boommobile personally working, but again, some tinkerer might figure out a way. I think it's much more likely to see play in Standard, albeit a slim chance. Next, we have a really cool one. This is Chandra, a new Chandra Planeswalker, Chandra Spark Hunter, pulling the Aetherdrift. The most noteworthy thing about this Chandra is her static ability, where she, at the start of combat, will bring a vehicle to life, which can attack. I think that is probably going to at least inspire people to try out cheap vehicles with this. The one that comes to mind is the 2-mana blue artifact vehicle, the one that makes a map token from Ixalan. Something Schooner, I believe it's called. I can't remember exactly what it was. My editor will put it on the screen, I'm sure. I think that card could be pretty decent. There's probably a 3-mana vehicle that you can ramp straight into with this. I think both could be very valid targets for Chandra Spark Hunter. Outside of that, she can make her own little vehicle, which I think is cool. I think her ult is a very realistic target to hit in Standard. If you don't deal with her immediately, she can absolutely threaten it very quickly. And I think that emblem is probably a game ender. So the most abusable case I can see with that is treasures. Having said that, in Commander, I wouldn't recommend running this in a treasure deck. I think you will find there are much better payoffs for something like that. I think Chandra Spark Hunter will be really good in a mid-range sort of deck that doesn't exist yet, which does give me a little bit of pause. However, I think the card might be powerful enough that you do build around it. I'm personally going to be trying her in an Is It build. It'll be one of my first decks, I reckon. Next up, we have a new Daretti. He has also been desparked. This was a card that was revealed much earlier. However, I thought it would be fitting to do it now among all the other first reveals. Daretti does his best impression of Goblin Welder, a very powerful card and Commander All-Star that effectively lets you swap an artifact from in play with one in the graveyard. However, compared to Goblin Welder, Daretti is much more expensive, which I think ultimately will hold him back. His first bit of text that makes him strong equal to the amount of artifacts you control, I don't think is particularly relevant. I think you're mainly going to want to use him for his second ability. Having said that, it is an enter or attack trigger, meaning if you can somehow give him haste, you can activate it twice in one turn, which I think is pretty good. In Standard, I could see a world where someone wants to do that. However, I don't know too many artifacts people will want to swap in and out. Portal to Phyrexia is probably the one that stands out the most. We do have that card for the rest of the year, and that card, once it enters the battlefield, pretty much ends the game on the spot. It's a big cost to put a card like that in your deck, though. So Daretti, I'm a little bit skeptical on, but we'll see. Someone might figure it out. Next card is probably one of the strongest cards we're going to talk about today. This is Drakorion Engineer, and I cannot get enough of this card. This card is amazing even without being a goblin. Some people might see the goblin tag and think, oh, it goes in a goblin deck. I think you will play this card in any deck that is mid-range or later. And the reason being is its ability to sink mana into it. Early on, it's just a humble 2-mana 2/2. But at instant speed, you can activate any of its other two abilities, and both of these are very relevant. Making a 4/4 later is super good. And on top of that, you can give something haste with it. You can spend 7 mana to get 7/7 worth of stats if you really want to. I think it cannot be stated that this card is going to make an impression on the game. I think this is one of the strongest cards we've seen in Standard. I do think that in Commander, the first exhaust ability to give things haste is relevant. I think people will really use that. I think Goblin decks will possibly care about that a lot too. You can make lots of goblins with Cranko and at the same time haste them out. In fact, you can do that in Standard now too. I do think this is a card to watch, and I will be picking up 4 copies of this the moment I can. Very powerful card, and I expect to see this card a lot if red is a really powerful color. Going to the other side, we have Hazoret, and I'm a bit disappointed in this card. This is another Start Your Engines card. Indestructible haste 5/3 for 2 mana, which on paper sounds amazing. The thing that holds it back is the fact it does nothing until your engines are fully started. I think its ability that it can activate isn't particularly relevant. I don't think Mono Red really has time to be waiting 4 turns to be activating this, and that's best case. They obviously need to damage their opponent every turn, which is pretty easy for Red to do, albeit, but I still don't think they play this. I struggle to see a world where this exists. For that reason, I kind of put it in towards the bottom of the list, unfortunately. Next card is our first common. I don't normally cover commons and uncommons unless I feel they're worth warranting to cover. This is one of them. This is a Prowlcatcher Specialist. It is a 2-mana 2/1 with haste, and haste is the exact reason why this card is being covered, because goblins will love this card. Additionally, if that wasn't good enough, it has an ability it can activate later on to give itself a +2/+2. So it can be a 4/3 with haste, which I think is really relevant, particularly if you're an aggro deck that's run out of steam. So if there are goblin decks out there, this will be a card that pops up. Could also see it working in a Cranko deck, however, I think it's a little less likely. I think there's plenty of good goblins out there at this point. but I do think Prowlcatcher Specialist is one to watch. I think Haste in particular is really important on Goblins at the moment, since they've had some new... There was that Foundations Goblin that has Raid, which means when you attack you get a benefit, and I think cards like this really synergize well with that one. So one to watch for sure. Next we have a dinosaur. We're going to Argonasaur Rex. I hope I'm saying that right. This is a 5 mana 8/8 with Trample. Holy hell. That's really good. The only problem is it doesn't have a way to protect itself, and if a card can be removed, it's no better than, you know, a 3/3 for 3. I like its cycle ability. I think that could be relevant. However, I think this is probably a Timmy card, for lack of a better word. Dinosaurs are already a very popular Timmy archetype, and I mean Timmy in the most friendly way. I just don't think green decks in Standard are going to want to really run this. I think they'll play it and then it'll get removed and they'll feel bad they didn't do anything else with the mana. You really do need to play a creature and have it make an impact immediately, or have some way to keep itself going. Unfortunately, I don't think Argonasaur Rex really fits the mold there. I do expect we'll see this card in Commander though, simply by virtue of dinosaurs being really popular. I think that ability is relevant for dinosaur decks, and I expect to see it there. Next up we have Elvish Refueler. This is an uncommon from the set, which I want to make note of because of its ability to do exhaust multiple times. I think this card is an enabler for cards with very powerful exhaust effects. I don't think we'll see much of that. There is one I will cover later that could be a possible candidate for that. I think it's an important card to be aware exists though. If you have a deck that wants to abuse exhaust, this is probably one of the ways you're going to be doing it if you're not blinking or re-triggering a creature entering the battlefield in some form. Nothing really more to say about this card. I think its potential is decent. I think it's contingent on whether or not there's a really strong exhaust card, but one to watch. Thunderous Velocipede is a new mythic vehicle for green. I liken this card more to an enchantment than anything else. It can be a 3 mana 5/5 if you'd like it to be. Alternatively, I think this card is an excellent way to buff creatures. It buffs all creatures, not just non-token ones, which I think is quite rare at the moment. Interestingly, a creature that was a 1/1 that gets buffed by it... Oh, actually, no, I'm reading this wrong. A creature that is 2 power or less that comes into the battlefield after this comes in gets buffed and can crew it. Unfortunately, 1/1s don't fit that. I think the best decks that will abuse this will be ones that can mass creatures up. I do think that the 4 mana or 5 mana or greater value to get 3 1/1 counters is a little bit of a trap. I don't think it will matter that much. Obviously, it'd be nice to have a bigger creature, but I think by then it's the same problem as the dinosaur had, where it's still vulnerable to removal, etc. A lot of the value that creatures bring isn't, when particularly bigger creatures, is tied more to their ability rather than their stat line. It'll be nice to have, but I suspect the strongest use of this will be making a big wide army with it. I definitely think this card will pop up in EDH. I would definitely expect to see this in a go wide deck with green in it. I think crewing it's pretty convenient as well if you need a blocker. Trample is also not irrelevant. But yeah, one to watch for sure. Next we have a card I'm quite interested in, and this is Achik Emerald Radian. This is a legendary insect that effectively creates a swarm of insects when it enters the battlefield equal to the amount of cards, or I should say the amount of artifact and creature cards in your graveyard. That text absolutely makes it a finisher of some kind. You would need to be in a self-mill style deck to really take full advantage of this. With those insects you make, you also buff up this creature when they die, and they also lose 1 life, they being your opponents, which I think is potentially relevant. I think Blood Artist effects are pretty damn good. I think this card would be a really fun commander, and I do think this card could be a really interesting finisher in the right Golgari deck. Potentially more colors than that remains to be seen. It is 6 mana. I don't think you would have cards more expensive than it, and I do think you would have a very creature-heavy deck. I'm thinking of something maybe with the Black Overlord, for example. I think this will be a kind of card I experiment with and really see if it has a home though. Definitely wouldn't be something you run more than 2 copies of though, I suspect. Our next card is Bright Glass Gear Hulk. This is the first in a line of Gear Hulks that are going to be coming out this set. They are not all 4 mana, but they all do seem to be at least 2 colors, and 2 of said 2 colors. This one is a 4 mana one with First Strike and Trample, which I think is pretty relevant. More importantly, however, it has an ETB that I think could have some potential. It lets you search your library for up to 2 artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. A card like this is a powerful creature on its own that can support a specific strategy. That's how I would view it. In Commander, this obviously gets your Soul Ring. I don't think it needs to be said how strong that is. It also grabs Moxen in the right strategy if you're playing really high power level stuff, though I think if you're at that stage, maybe you don't play a card like Bright Glass Gear Hulk. I do think, though, if you pull this card, you'll be pretty interested in playing it. I think the weakness of this cycle in general, though, is going to be its cost. 2 green, 2 white, and subsequently for each of the others, 2 of a specific color. That's a very rigid cost. It's going to be quite difficult to run that and play it on turn 4 in anything but those exact colors. Even if you run 3 colors, you might find it more difficult as well. I do think the impact is there. I don't see a standard deck that has a specific set of cards it's going to tutor with this, which is, a combo-y kind of element that I think this card would do well in. I do think it's powerful though, and I would expect to see it. Whether or not it actually lasts remains to be seen. I would probably say it has more potential in Commander than it does in Standard though, for the moment. Next we have Captain Howler, Sea Scourge, a legendary shark pirate in Izzet with a really good ward cost. I don't think that can be ignored. I do think that's pretty relevant, which seems to synergize with discarding cards. Blue and red are pretty good at doing rummaging, which is discard a card, draw a card, and I think this card would slot right into a strategy that's doing that. I think this would be a really fun build around Commander, and the payoff being drawing a card is always really good. You do need to deal combat damage to the player to get the benefit. Having said that though, if you do go wide enough and activate this buff on enough creatures, I think that will be pretty straightforward to do. I definitely think this is more of a Commander than a card that you put into the 99. In Standard, this could be a potential role player in a mid-range Izzet kind of deck. I don't really see this card being in an aggro or anything faster, simply because it requires a bit of setup with discard. Outside of that, no, I think it'll be mainly, it could be a more slower paced card too, given the fact that you do get the ability to rummage. Needing creatures though does sort of steer it away from anything that isn't mid-range. An interesting card though. I do think it's probably more likely to be a Commander than anything else. Next we have Caradora, Heart of Alacria. I hope I'm saying that right. This is a human knight, another legendary creature in Selesnya, green and white. This card tutors when it enters the battlefield. That's a pretty boring effect, but undoubtedly very powerful. The things it could tutor for are mounts and vehicles. So you would effectively use this as the commander of your said mount or vehicle deck. I'd probably say mounts, given the fact that a lot of them are in those colors. Outside of that, it doubles counters. Pretty popular effect in Commander. I think this is probably the commander of a deck that blinks it out, uses it to get card advantage, and gets lots of mounts. You probably need to find a way to crew your mounts and vehicles. Obviously, this card can do that, but if you have enough of them out, you'll need other ways. And then you probably want to combine it with counters. I think it's an interesting design space. I'm generally not a fan of tutoring in Commander. I think that makes games a bit samey. Again, I think in Standard, this could be an interesting card as another mid-range sort of piece. Potentially also an aggro card, because it does refuel your hand a little bit. It'd probably be the top end. There would need to be a really powerful vehicle or mount to play. That's probably cheaper than that. Or you could have a 1 of 5 costed mount or vehicle. Probably a mount, because you want it to just be a creature on its own. An interesting card. I think it probably needs to be watched, because I do think a card like this that looks for specific cards could be pretty strong in the right context. I'll say it has a pretty decent amount of potential then. Next card is Far Fortune End Boss. I'm just going to come out and say it, that this is now the third in a series of cards with Start Your Engines that falls pretty flat, if I'm being honest. I think the effect is interesting, where when you attack, you deal 1 damage to each opponent, and it has a max speed effect, so once you've started your engine to the max, you deal extra damage with that. I think there's way better ways to do that, particularly in Commander. Even in Standard there is. I don't think there's much more that needs to be said about this card. I don't think it's really going anywhere. Alright, next we have Colladin, Triumph Caster. Another Commander card, I would say. It is a 2-mana 2/3 without ability most of the time, which does make it pretty weak in Standard. Obviously, there's the dream of being able to have it live a turn and play another creature or a vehicle that can immediately go. I just don't think that's impactful enough, and there's too many things that need to happen for that to work. However, in Commander, I do think we're going to be seeing him. I think Colladin will be one of the more popular commanders. I expect he'll be piloting lots of vehicle decks in the future. Mainly vehicles, I suspect, maybe the odd mount deck. But yeah, I reckon when you're thinking of vehicle commanders, Colladin's going to come top of the list for that. He's cheap to get out, and he enables a whole strategy. And I think a lot of people really like that in a commander. Alright, next we have another doozy of a card. This is Loot, the Pathfinder. Loot is back again. I think this has been his 3rd or 4th time now, I've lost count. And in an attempt to finally make him playable, it seems Wizards of the Coast have absolutely pushed him, because this card is very strong. Effectively, if I were you, I would read this card's cost as a 6-mana card rather than 5, because you're going to want to play this, attack with it. If your opponent tries to respond, remove it, whatever, you activate one of its abilities. I think the 2 main ones that are going to be relevant are the first 2. Probably the middle one, to draw 3 cards the most. I think that's such an amazing thing to get in the middle of the game. This is the kind of card that you probably do want to play in a slower match, but I do think that being a 2/4 with haste, double strike, that's relevant. I think there are ways where you could absolutely play this in, an aggro matchup and not be miserable, Obviously, dealing 3 damage to any target's really relevant in those kind of matchups too. I think this card will be very good, and I expect to see Loot a lot. I think in Commander, Loot reminds me a lot of Kenrith, the Returned King. I think he's what I would call a good stuff commander, where you just play him as the commander of a deck that's in green, blue, and red, and you just run the best cards in it. I do think that is a very strong deck. I think that will be a very strong card, honestly. I think Loot will probably be one of the chase cards of the set. The anime art of him is pretty adorable. But yeah, I think Wizards have finally done it. I think Loot is finally going to be in our faces even more. Next up is Mendicant Core Guidelight. He has power equal to the number of artifacts you control. Not necessarily relevant. It will include himself. And this also has Start Your Engines. And the Start Your Engines effect is really powerful. When you cast an artifact spell, pay 1 and copy it. Right now, Azurius plays Simulacrum Synthesizer. I was about to say Solemn Simulacrum as an artifact deck. I don't think this card enables that, unfortunately. I think one of the struggles of this card is going to be fully starting your engine. I don't think white and blue are particularly effective at dealing damage when there are no creatures on the board, which is what I think holds them back ultimately. I think Start Your Engine as a mechanic is going to be very reliant on being able to damage your opponent, even when you don't have creatures on the board. So I'm thinking of Rakdos, where red can bolt you in the face and black can just make you lose life, because that's what that color does. I think those 2 colors in particular will be really good at that mechanic. So unfortunately, I don't think our Guidelight friend here will do the job. I do like his ability though, but again, I just don't see it happening. Maybe in a Commander game. I would say in Commander he's probably a lot more playable, but I do not think he's going to have a home in Standard, unfortunately. Next we have Oil Deep Gearhulk. The Dimir Gearhulk, which is also 2 blue and 2 black. Like I said, this is probably one of the weaknesses of this cycle. I've seen a lot of people dismiss this card. I think the most powerful thing about this card is probably its keywords. Lifelink and Ward 1, definitely not irrelevant. I do think Ward 1 is a lot softer than Ward 2. Its effect is interesting, being that you can also target yourself, so you can choose yourself and effectively rummage a card. Goodness. Interestingly, if your hand is empty when you play this, if I'm reading this right, you flat out draw a card, which I do think means this card could see play as the top of an aggro, some sort of super aggressive deck. So I don't think it's irrelevant, actually. I would say it does have some potential in Standard. I think in Commander, this card's not going to really see any play. Time will tell. This could be one of the weaker Gear Hulks. I hope it is. I would like to see a pretty powerful Gear Hulk to force me into some unpopular colors. Dimir right now is above and beyond probably the most popular 2-color combination, so it's not like they really needed a strong Gear Hulk anyway. But yeah. Alright, now we have the other Gear Hulk that's been revealed. This is Pyrewood Gear Hulk. This is the red-green one, and this is a finisher, straight up. You will play this, or probably cheat this out, although it is 6 mana and you are in green, so there is a world where you could play this for 6. But you want to play this when you have a lot of other creatures. Green is pretty good at making a wide army. Unfortunately, this card is no Craterhoof Behemoth for the Commander players out there. It probably does a pretty good impression of it, where it wins you the game, perhaps. I think in Standard, this card definitely absolutely slams people if you can play it when you have a board, but you're already probably winning by then. If I had to predict, I don't think this card probably sees much play. Though if it does, it's probably as I said, a finisher in some sort of go-wide deck that can build up a board very fast, kind of like Boros Convoke, and then cheat this out. That's what I would expect. Alright, next card is one I've seen a lot of people talk about. This is Redshift Rocketeer. Redshift is an interesting card that with Vigilance can attack, right? But then you can tap it afterwards to add mana to spend on abilities. Probably the most noteworthy thing about it is if you can somehow muster 12 mana, you can put all the cards that are permanents from your hand onto the battlefield. Pretty damn powerful effect. Probably game winning in a 1v1. In a Commander game, maybe. I think as a Commander, this could be a very fun card. I don't know if you run it in any other context in Commander. You really do need to build around this card to get the most out of it. You want to be buffing it up. And then you want to balance that with permanents that just absolutely go wild when they enter the battlefield. In Standard, probably not going to see play, probably more likely to be a Commander. We already have Galter from Ixalan in Standard, which isn't really seeing much play, and that's probably a more safer way to activate this exhaust ability. So it does make me a bit skeptical we'll see Redshift. Next we have an uncommon I wanted to point out. This is Rocketeer Boostbug, mainly because when this thing attacks it makes a treasure. I think there is a lot of hidden synergy in Standard right now that cares about sacrificing permanents, and I think this might be also one of the most effortless ways to make treasure currently in Standard. And as Commander players would know, treasure is very strong. Being able to just even temporarily ramp or temporarily make an artifact that you can use at your whim is a very powerful effect. Additionally, if it wasn't strong enough, it has the ability to crew itself the next turn after you play it, which I think is going to make it really relevant. It basically, if you don't have a turn 3 play or don't want to play something turn 3, you can basically just buff this up, swing and get a treasure, and I think players will do that. In terms of the strategy or deck this appears in, I don't think Gruul has a lot of strategies right now that really are about surviving or getting to the mid-game. Gruul mostly just plays mice and smacks you in the face. But I do think this could open up some possibilities. I would not be surprised to see this card as a common card in some sort of mid-range / artifact or sacrifice-related deck in the future. Maybe Jund, if there's enough support for 3 colors, maybe Jund Sacrifice plays a card like this in Standard. We will see. In Commander, this is not really going to see any play, but I do think this card has quite a bit of potential. Next is Sabsunan Luxa Embodied. Oh boy. This is a god. Not literally, more so it is creature type god. Reach, Trample, Indestructible. So it follows what a lot of the Armenket gods do. I think this one's really good. Like, really, really good. I think this is a build-around card. The turn it comes in, it can block, which is really crucial. The turn you pass, it gets a 1/1 counter on it, and then you draw 2 cards. Because it has indestructible, it's a lot more sticky, it's harder to remove. Obviously there's effects like Sunfall and Leyline Binding that make things a bit harder, but I do think that they're far and few enough between that you can afford to run a card like this. I think this card is a build around in a strategy that involves +1/+1 counters. So the turn you play it, you block with it or defend with it, it gets bigger next turn, can't attack or block. That's the turn you buff it to back to an even number. You can attack with it, it's an 8/8, and then you pass the turn and it draws you 2 cards the next turn. I think there is absolutely enough of a reason to run a card like this. I think Simic is a really good color combination at the moment, though, and I think people are starting to realize that. Synergizes with quite a lot of powerful cards. Up the Beanstalk, it's a 5-mana card. Yeah, I expect we'll be seeing this card quite a bit. And I think it may be possibly a problematic card. We will have to see. In Commander, I definitely think this is an interesting card for Simic to play. I think there's a lot of Simic counters decks that could want this card. I do think it makes an interesting commander too. I reckon we'll be seeing this card quite a bit, and so I rate it really highly. Next card on the list is Sitavama Masked Racer. This is a 2-mana 2/3 with a single exhaust ability. The ability looks cool, definitely. She will buff up herself, then all creatures on your side of the battlefield to her power. I don't think this will make an impact in Standard, unfortunately. Simic tokens isn't really a thing at the moment, and I don't think if it ever becomes a thing, this is the kind of payoff that they need. I think this is probably a bit too slow to fit there, particularly when you can just run overrun effects and just do the same thing, right? Rather than run a creature that can just be shut down. Outside of that, yeah, I don't think she even really sees play in Commander, which is a shame. She was a pretty cool character in the story, but no, not this time, unfortunately, Cedar. Next we have Winter, back from Duskmourn. Winter is back with a vengeance. He has decided to dye his hair blue and become a blue-black creature. His ward cost is interesting. Not particularly relevant unless you're doing a super aggro deck. That ward cost is the same as Gev, which Lizards were a very aggressive deck in Bloomburrow, and that's why that ward cost was particularly problematic. Winter here has a really interesting effect. However, I don't think it will make an impact. I think he could see play in a Dimir splashed artifact deck in Commander, maybe. You also need to be milling a lot of cards to get this ability. It does hit non-artifact creatures, which could be relevant. But personally, I just don't think there's enough support there for Winter. I don't expect we'll be seeing him. Next we have Zahir Glory's Past, an Orzhov 2-mana commander, also with Start Your Engines. And unfortunately, just like Start Your Engines, I don't think this card will see play. We really need a way to... We need to see a much stronger creature without needing to be at max speed before I think we really see these kind of creatures. I think the payoffs aren't strong enough really to justify the process of damaging your opponent 3 times. I think there's just too much work to do there for what you get. Zahir's interestingly a cat, so it could be an Orzhov cat commander. We've never had a legendary cat in black. I do think it's an interesting Aristocrats deck. I think the sacrifice only being able to activate 1 turn is a bit of a shame, but I get why they do it. Otherwise, this card would probably be much better. I do think that gives it some standard potential as a sacrifice outlet. It's probably the strongest of the Start Your Engines cards, but again, I just don't see it really making a splash, unfortunately. Next we have the Lifecraft Engine. This is a 3-mana vehicle that can be any creature type, and for that reason you're going to see it in Commander. I think this will be played in your jankiest creature type decks. Whether or not people are happy about it or not remains to be seen. It buffs all those creatures up too. That's really all there is to say about it. In Standard, I don't think it sees play in a traditional creature type deck. However, it's probably worth pointing out that you can name Ninja with this card, and Kaito from Duskmourn has a +1 that buffs ninjas. So that's probably the area where this is most likely to see play, if at all. I think we already have a land that is every creature type that fills that role pretty nicely, honestly. So I don't think you really need to sacrifice a deck slot to run this. Next, we have Amonkhet Raceway. Do not let the uncommon and start your engines deceive you. This is how we start our engines turn 1. So we bring, we start our max speed quest. What's probably more likely is you play a mountain or an island turn 1, play a 1-cost creature, then play this on turn 2. Not only to start your engines, but to also attack your opponent and get it to 2. Outside of that, this is an untapped land that taps for colorless, but more crucially is its second ability. Max speed, target creature gains haste. I think this text absolutely fundamentally breaks this card. I think this is going to be a really problematic card in Standard, particularly in decks that have creatures that have enters and attacks triggers. In the late game, once you've done enough damage over time to get max speed. I think there will be a lot of win out of nowheres because of this card, and some people might not like that. I think in Commander, this card's great. Arena of Glory is a really good card in Commander, and this is a colorless way to get that effect. I think Start Your Engines is much more practical to achieve in Commander, simply because you can play the game over a couple turns. There'll always be an opponent probably to deal damage to that doesn't have as many blockers or you can get through. I do think there is a world for Amonkhet Raceway, and I do think this card is going to be possibly oppressive in Standard. Time will tell. I hope I'm wrong. I am a bit worried about this card, though. Next, we have the Verge cycle from this set. So the Duskmourn Allied Verges came out a few months ago. Now we have the Enemy Verges. These are going to be as good as the other Verges. Not much more really to say about that. It's great that we got the enemy ones. I think this will open up a few more new strategies. These cards in Commander are some of the best dual lands you can get. You're always happy if you open a pack with a Verge in it, because you put it straight into a deck that needs one. They're really good for 2-color decks mainly, but again, I do think that there may be potential with this set as well as the Allied Verges to start seeing some 3-colored strategies pop up. We will see. Now we have the other Start Your Engines land I wanted to talk about. This one is Ancient Tomb. Not quite. It becomes Ancient Tomb. You may be familiar with a card called Temple of the False God if you play Commander. That card is crap. This card is the future. You can start your engines as soon as turn 1 if you like, but when you do eventually go up to 4, you will have effectively ramped. This is Sol Ring at that point, though not quite. Possibly better. I do think this card will be great. I don't think this card will be as impactful as a card like Sol Ring, since that card is online as soon as the game starts, but I do think this card will be really strong. I do think it's a bit weaker in Standard. I don't think there's a particularly strong deck that sticks out to me that will want to play this. Domain is very color hungry. So being able to ramp, and again, Domain really struggles to deal damage to you early. So I don't think there's a real Standard deck that sticks out that plays this at the moment. There could be a world where you want to have an X spell and you just get an extra mana to pump into this at the end of a game. I think this is a card to watch for in EDH, personally. I think Commander players, you will be happy to pull any of these cards. And then the last cards we're going to cover today are the Road Cycle. So these are the uncommon lands of the set. They remind me a lot of the Bloomburrow Villages, where they were cards that were relevant to the particular mechanical theme of the set. These ones enter tapped unless you control a mount or a vehicle, which is a little bit narrow. I think this will be great in Draft, but we're not talking about Draft. I don't really think you'll play these in Constructed. And there may be a world where you play, say, this blue one in the Kamigawa vehicle deck. I don't remember the name. I think Shurikai maybe. But outside of that, no, I don't think these will see much play. And that wraps up all the cards for today. As you see, I might be a little bit more pessimistic in terms of what cards I think are viable. I think there are a few I think there are a few outliers in the bunch to watch. But for the most part, I think it was a really interesting first day. There are some cards in here I'll be keeping my eye on though, and I will see you guys bright and early for the next batch of spoilers tomorrow.